Hi guys, welcome to this video on the James-Lange theory of emotion. We're going to take you through what you need to know, the basics of the theory. It's quite a complicated theory if you don't know it, but we're going to try and break it down into as simple steps as possible, and we're going to evaluate it as well to cover everything you need that will get you through your psychology GCSE. So basically, two men called James and Lange, William James and Carl Lange, were kind of investigating emotions around about the same time, and ironically were kind of having similar ideas. So they kind of just decided to put their ideas together and make a theory, and strangely enough, that can be worth a mark in the exam. So there you go, get your first mark. But basically they were interested in the idea of when an emotion is actually processed by the brain. So for years and years, everyone just assumed that when we were upset, we would start crying, or when we were happy, we would smile. But actually, James Lange believed it was the other way around. Let's try and explain that. So what James Lange believed, and what the theory says, is that our emotions are just us noticing and interpreting physiological changes within the body. So, for example, I'll put the flowchart on the screen here. This is essentially the process that they think an emotion goes through. So, an event happens. So, for example, you just receive a negative text, and this causes some sort of arousal in the body. So, in that case, a negative text might create a tear or two in the eye, and to which the brain will process that arousal. So the tears will get processed by the brain, and then the brain will essentially interpret that, process it, and create and understand that you're going through the emotion of sadness. So what's actually happening is the emotion is coming at the very end of the process. So it's not a case of I'm sad, so I'm now going to cry, or I'm happy, so I'm now going to smile. It's actually that the body has an automatic reaction to an event, an automatic physiological reaction, and the brain will interpret that reaction and then determine that there's an emotion. So there's loads of different examples that you could go through to try and understand it. But here's one for fear. So if we take an example of a bear encounter in the woods, it's a nice easy one. It would never really happen in England, but it's a nice easy one. If we use the James-Lange theory, the event is that the bear jumps out of the woods. The arousal is that maybe the heart rate will increase, we'll start breathing more, maybe we'll get goosebumps and our hairs will stand on their ends. Our brain will then go through the process of interpreting that, so it will notice all of those changes, and then the brain will essentially realise that we've entered an emotional state of fear. It's taking emotions and it's looking at them in a completely new way that we never really thought about before. So if I was going to summarise it, and things that I would definitely put into an exam answer, it's the idea that they said that emotions are just us noticing and interpreting physiological changes in the body. I would make reference to the flowchart. I would explain it. I would say how an event occurs. It causes arousal. The brain interprets the arousal, and then we realise that we're experiencing an emotion. And the kind of a quote to kind of describe what they were trying to get across is this one: we do not cry because we are upset. We are upset because we cry. And you can swap that out for any emotion and it would still work. That's their theory, and that's what they believe about emotions. Completely opposite to what we would have always thought. So if I was going to explain it for the exam, how would I explain that theory? I would kind of explain it a bit like this. Feel free to use it to inspire you and help you with your explanation. The James-Lange theory of emotion was suggested by two men who had a similar idea around the same time. The theory says that our emotions are just us noticing and interpreting physical changes in our body. For example, when an event occurs, like a scary exam, it causes arousal in the body, such as a heart rate increase. Our brain processes this physiological change and interprets it and gives an emotion. Overall, they believed that we feel sad, because we cry. We do not cry because we're sad. So that's a pretty decent explanation, and that will have you covered. Now, it could follow up with an evaluation question. So if we were going to evaluate it, here are some things that you could use in the exam. You could start with the idea of that there is evidence to support the theory that the physiological change increases and causes us to feel an emotion. So there is evidence that if you put a pencil between your teeth, it pressures you into a smile, it forces you into like a fake smile, uses the same muscles, and then people literally report that they do feel happier and find jokes funnier when they have this going on. So the body is processing the physiological changes and making us happier. So the happiness is coming after the change. So that's good evidence. We have real evidence from sort of phobias and panic disorders as well to support the theory. So if you're really afraid of spiders or public speaking, for example, you will experience immediate panic attack arousal when you're told about the thing is that you're afraid of. So if you're majorly afraid of public speaking and someone says you need to do it, you will instantly go into a panic attack, instant arousal before you actually realise that you are feeling afraid. In terms of criticising the theory, we could criticise it for being quite reductionist. So it's a little bit simplified. Emotions are quite complicated. So a lot of emotions have the same physiological responses. For example, like heart rate goes up when you're scared, when you're sad, when you're happy, when you're shocked, excited. So how is it exactly that the brain figures out the difference between that one physiological change and all those emotions? So there's clearly a lot more going on for our brain to figure out what emotion we're experiencing. So it doesn't quite cover everything. There is an example of an emotion where the physiological response actually does come after the emotion. And we talked about in class about the emotion of embarrassment. So, we've talked about times where, you fall over, maybe you trip up, you do something silly and you kind of go, just in your own mind, that's a little bit embarrassing, isn't it? But you don't actually have any physiological arousal. But then when you stand up and dust yourself down and then you look around and you realise that 10 people are looking and pointing at you, that's when you go quite red and your heart rate shoots up. So that's a case of the physiological arousals actually come after the emotion. So, there's an example there where an emotion that doesn't quite fit the theory. So you can kind of challenge the theory there. And finally, this is a good one that you guys came up with in class. Times where there are emotions that come on with no event and no arousal. So we've talked about people that are quite severely depressed, or you might just be sat at home and suddenly you're overcome with feelings of sadness. Nothing's happened, no event, no real arousal. For some reason, people just randomly get really sad. And that's kind of an example of something that is not explained by the James-Lange theory. Where does that random emotion come from? So if you're going to evaluate for the exam, you've got to remember, rule of thumb, however many marks it's worth, half it. That's a good idea of how many evaluations you need to go for. So whatever evaluation you're going to go for, make sure you identify your evaluation and make sure you explain it. Otherwise you'll lose marks or you won't get credited for showing full understanding. So look at the red and the purple bit. So for example, if I put something like, one problem with the James-Lange theory is that it's been criticised for being reductionist and simplifying emotions. That's good, but I'm never going to get maximum marks unless I explain why. So I need to go something like, as lots of emotions are associated with the same changes, like a faster heart rate, we don't quite understand how the brain interprets different emotions from the same physiological changes. Perhaps there are chemicals in the brain that the theory is ignoring. You just got to give a bit more of an explanation as to why it's an evaluation, guys. Anyway, right, that's everything you need to know about the James-Lange theory. So watch this video as many times as you need to. Once you get it down, it's a really good theory to explain. It's a really good one to talk about. A little bit confusing at first, but once you've got it, it's a good one.